There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that retrospectively become the load-bearing walls of your entire emotional architecture. They are rarely loud. There is no fanfare, no cinematic score swelling in the background. They are often quiet, steeped in the mundane light of a Tuesday afternoon or the pre-dawn gloom of a shared university apartment. For me, the most significant of these moments smelled of chlorine and old books and the faint, sweet scent of the laundry detergent Leo always used too much of. It was the moment I realized that the careful, self-imposed boundary I had built around my heart was not a fortress, but a flimsy screen door, and that he had been standing on the other side of it the entire time, his hand resting gently on the handle, just waiting. He was asleep, a dead weight against my side, his head pillowed on my shoulder. The television across the room was still on, muted, its shifting colors painting the planes of his face in strobing blues and golds. We had been studying, or rather, I had been studying, and he had been providing a running, nonsensical commentary on my psychology textbook until his words had softened, slurred, and finally trailed off into the soft, even cadence of his breathing. This was not the first time it had happened. In the months since his world had been spectacularly upended, our evenings had developed a ritualistic quality, a slow dance of feigned casualness that always ended like this, with him seeking some form of physical anchor and me becoming that anchor, holding my breath and trying not to read a universe of meaning into the simple, desperate gravity of his touch. His arm was draped across my stomach, his fingers loosely curled into the fabric of my t-shirt, and I could feel the faint thrum of his pulse against my ribs. It felt like a conversation, a quiet, cellular language that bypassed all the clumsy architecture of words. I remember thinking, in that specific, suspended moment, about the nature of space. The physical space between two bodies, the emotional space between two friends, and the vast, uncharted territory that lay between the two. For years, I had been a diligent cartographer of the space between Leo and me. I had mapped its borders, respected its customs, and memorized its safe passages. It was a friendship, a deep and profoundly important one, but it had clearly defined lines. He was the sun, and I was a planet caught in his orbit, content to circle at a safe distance, warmed by his light, but never daring to get close enough to burn. But now, with his breath warming the side of my neck and the solid, trusting weight of him grounding me to the couch, all my maps felt useless. The borders had dissolved. The territory was new, and it was terrifying, and it felt more like home than any place I had ever known. I was a photographer by trade and by temperament. I spent my life observing from a distance, capturing moments without ever truly being in them. But here, in the quiet intimacy of our living room, I was not behind the lens. I was in the frame, and the image being developed was one of raw, terrifying, and beautiful vulnerability. His vulnerability and my own. We met in the most unglamorous way possible, a university housing assignment. I had arrived first, my meticulously packed boxes of photography equipment, books, and darkroom chemicals stacked neatly on one side of the small, cinder block room. I was creating order, my own quiet corner in a world that always felt too loud. Then the door had burst open and Leo had blown in like a hurricane, all kinetic energy and broad smiles. He didn't have boxes. He had a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a swim bag in his hand, and he dropped them both in the middle of the floor with a thud that seemed to shake the whole building. He smelled powerfully of chlorine, a scent that would become as familiar to me as my own. He introduced himself not with a handshake, but with a clap on my shoulder that nearly sent me into my bookshelf. He was Leo, star butterfly swimmer for the university team, and he declared, with the unshakable confidence of an 18-year-old who had never known failure, that we were going to have the best year of our lives. I, the quiet observer with my vintage cameras and my preference for solitude, had serious doubts. In those early days, we were a study in contrasts, an odd couple of campus archetypes. He was a creature of noise and motion. His mornings started before dawn with the shrill alarm he always slept through, followed by a frantic rush to the pool. His afternoons were a whirlwind of classes, training, and social obligations. His nights were filled with the boisterous camaraderie of his teammates or the devoted attention of his then-girlfriend, a perpetually cheerful cheerleader named Jessica. My life, by comparison, was a long, quiet exposure. I moved through the world slowly, deliberately. My mornings were spent in the hushed sanctuary of the darkroom, watching images ghost into existence in the shallow trays of developer. My afternoons were for classes or long, solitary walks through the city, my camera a shield and a key, allowing me to engage with the world on my own terms. Our room was a physical manifestation of our differences. His side was a chaotic explosion of damp towels, textbooks, and discarded clothes. My side was a minimalist dream, a curated space of quiet grays and blacks. It shouldn't have worked. By all accounts, we should have driven each other insane within a week. But it did work. It worked because beneath Leo's boisterous exterior was a surprising current of gentleness and an almost childlike curiosity about my world. He never mocked my quiet passions. Instead, he would come back from a grueling practice, collapse on his bed, and ask me to show him the photos I had taken that day. He would look at my stark, black and white prints of forgotten city corners and lonely streetlights with a genuine, focused interest. He would ask questions about aperture and shutter speed, about the way I saw things, and he would listen, truly listen, to my fumbling explanations. He learned to move quietly when I was working on a delicate print, to recognize the focused set of my jaw that meant I was deep inside my own head. In return, I found myself drawn into his world. I started going to his swim meets, initially out of a sense of roommate obligation, but soon out of a genuine fascination. I saw a different Leo in the water. The loud, goofy boy disappeared, and in his place was an artist of immense power and grace. The chaotic energy he carried on land was transformed into focused, beautiful propulsion in the pool. I started photographing him, capturing the explosive spray of water as he launched from the blocks, the liquid poetry of his form slicing through the water, the quiet exhaustion on his face after a race. He loved the pictures. He said I made him look like something more than just a jock. He said I saw him. And I did see him. I saw all of it. I saw the pressure he was under to perform, the weight of his scholarship, the way his smile sometimes didn't quite reach his eyes when he was talking to his father on the phone. And because I saw him, truly saw him, I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a slow, creeping dawn, a gradual realization that the warmth I felt when he was near wasn't just friendship, that the ache in my chest when I saw him with Jessica was more than just the platonic loneliness of a single friend. It was a quiet, hopeless, and deeply inconvenient kind of love, the kind you build a fortress around. I became an expert in emotional self-preservation. I learned to smile and nod when he talked about Jessica. I perfected the art of the casual, friendly touch that conveyed support without betraying the desperate longing underneath. I became his best friend, his confidant, his quiet anchor in the whirlwind of his life. And I resigned myself to the fact that this was all I would ever be. It was a painful peace, but it was a peace nonetheless. I would rather have him in my life as a friend than not at all. This was the treaty I signed with my own heart, the foundational rule upon which our entire relationship was built. For 3 years, the treaty held. We moved out of the dorms and into a small, 2-bedroom apartment with another one of his teammates. The dynamic remained the same. Leo and Jessica were the campus golden couple, their future seemingly mapped out in bright, primary colors. I was the quiet, artistic friend who was always there, the stable, predictable element in their lives. I dated occasionally, short-lived, lukewarm affairs that never stood a chance against the quiet, colossal monument of my feelings for Leo. They were more like attempts to prove to myself that I could feel something for someone else, experiments that always ended in failure. Leo would sometimes try to set me up with people, an endeavor that was always excruciatingly awkward. He seemed to genuinely believe that my single status was a problem to be solved, a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. He couldn't comprehend the appeal of solitude, the comfort I found in my own quiet world. He saw it as loneliness, and in his own clumsy, well-meaning way, He wanted to fix it. I would let him try, endure a painfully stilted coffee date, and then report back that there was just no spark. He would sigh dramatically and promise to find someone better next time, never once suspecting that the spark he was looking for had already burned a hole straight through my chest. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle tremor but a seismic event. It happened in the fall of our senior year. I came home one afternoon to find the apartment unnaturally quiet. Leo was supposed to be at practice, but his swim bag was slumped by the door like a fallen soldier. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch in the dark, staring at the blank television screen. The air was thick with a kind of heavy, broken silence I had never experienced in our home before. I didn't need to ask. I could see the wreckage in the stillness of his shoulders, in the hollowed-out look in his eyes. I just sat down next to him, leaving a careful, respectful foot of space between us, and waited. For nearly an hour, we sat there in the gathering twilight, not speaking. Finally, in a voice that was rough and thin, he said her name. Jessica left me. It was a simple statement, a declarative sentence that carried the weight of a collapsed building. He explained it in broken fragments, the story punctuated by long, ragged silences. It wasn't a dramatic fight. It was worse. It was a quiet, clinical dismantling of their shared future. She had felt, for a long time, that they were moving in different directions. He was all about the immediate future, nationals, graduation, maybe a shot at the Olympic trials. She was thinking about careers, marriage, a life beyond the university bubble. She said he didn't know how to be serious, that he hid everything important behind a joke or a grin. She said she felt lonely even when she was with him. And then the final, killing blow, she had met someone else. A law student. Someone stable, someone adult. I listened, my heart a complicated knot of emotions. There was a selfish, shameful flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope, which I immediately extinguished with a wave of guilt. But the dominant feeling was a deep, profound ache for his pain. I had spent years watching him, studying him, and I knew how much of his identity was tied up in being Leo and Jessica. He was the golden boy, the successful athlete, the guy who had it all. And now, one of the central pillars of that identity had been kicked out from under him. He wasn't just heartbroken, he was lost. He didn't cry. It was somehow worse than crying. He just sat there, hollowed out, as if the vibrant, kinetic energy that always radiated from him had been siphoned away, leaving an empty vessel behind. When he finally finished talking, he slumped forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, broken silence from before. It was a silence that asked a question. It was the sound of someone waiting for a lifeline. So I did the only thing I could do. I closed the small, careful distance between us, put my arm around his shoulders, and pulled him in. He resisted for a second, his body stiff with shock and grief, and then he just collapsed against me, his head finding the hollow of my shoulder as if it were made to be there. And for the first time in the 3 years I had known him, Leo cried. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, desperate, and utterly devastating sound, a series of ragged, shuddering breaths that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of him. I just held him, one hand rubbing slow, useless circles on his back, the other cradling the back of his head. I didn't say a word. There were no words that would have been adequate. There was only the solid, irrefutable fact of my presence, of my body anchoring his. In that moment, the carefully maintained treaty was broken. The old maps were burned. A new territory was being charted, and its first landmark was his tears soaking the collar of my shirt. That night was the beginning of the ritual. After he had cried himself into an exhausted stupor, he didn't move. He just stayed there, curled against me on the couch. I eventually managed to coax him to his feet, intending to guide him to his own bedroom. But he stopped dead in the hallway, his eyes wide with something that looked like panic at the thought of his empty room. His room, which still held pictures of him and Jessica, ticket stubs from their first date, 100 small ghosts of a life that had just ended. He looked at his closed bedroom door like it was the entrance to a tomb. Then he looked at my door, which I always left slightly ajar. "Can I?" he started, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't even have to finish the sentence. I knew. I nodded, a single, short jerk of my chin, not trusting my own voice. I pushed my door open wider, and he followed me inside, moving like a sleepwalker. My room was my sanctuary, the one place that was entirely my own. It was a space of quiet order, of muted colors and soft light. It was the antithesis of the chaos he was feeling. He surveyed the room for a moment. Then his eyes landed on the pile of blankets and pillows I kept in the corner for when I was working on the floor. Without a word, he crossed the room, pulled a blanket free, and curled up on the small patch of rug beside my bed. He didn't ask for a pillow. He didn't complain. He just wrapped himself in the blanket, turned his face away from me, and fell silent. I stood there for a long time, watching the huddled shape on my floor, my heart beating a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I turned off the light, climbed into my own bed, and lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his breathing in the dark. It was the loneliest and least lonely I had ever felt in my entire life. The first night became the second, and the second became the third. The arrangement was never spoken of. He would simply appear at my doorway late in the evening, a silent question in his eyes, and I would nod him in. He would take his spot on the floor, and we would exist in the quiet darkness together. It was a strange, suspended reality. During the day, we would attempt a semblance of normalcy. I would make him eat. I would drag him to his classes. I would sit with him in the dining hall while his teammates tried to cheer him up with loud jokes and forced bravado. He moved through these days like a ghost, a pale imitation of his former self. His bright, easy smile was gone, replaced by a tight, strained expression. He was just going through the motions, a puppet with its strings cut. But at night, in the safety of my room, he would allow the mask to drop. He wouldn't talk about her, not directly. He would just be there, a quiet, wounded presence on my floor. About a week into this new, unspoken routine, the first escalation occurred. I was woken in the middle of the night by a sound, a choked, desperate noise. I sat up, my heart pounding, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the window, I could see that he was thrashing in his blanket, caught in the grips of a nightmare. I was out of bed before I was even fully conscious, kneeling on the floor beside him. I put a hand on his shoulder, shaking him gently. "Leo," I whispered. "Leo, wake up. You're dreaming." His eyes flew open, wide and unfocused, glistening with sweat and unshed tears. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't seem to recognize me for a moment. He just looked lost, utterly and completely terrified. Then his focus sharpened, and a wave of something, relief, shame, exhaustion, washed over his face. "Sorry," he mumbled, pushing himself up onto his elbows. "Bad dream, it's okay," I said, my voice still thick with sleep. "You're okay." He looked at the empty space in my bed, then back at his makeshift nest on the cold, hard floor. A shiver racked his body, one that I suspected had little to do with the temperature of the room. He seemed so small in that moment, so stripped of all his usual bravado. The silence stretched, filled with the unspoken. I knew what he needed, what he was too proud or too confused to ask for. My own fear was a cold knot in my stomach, a voice screaming at me about boundaries and self-preservation. But the sight of him, so broken and so close, drowned it out. I made the decision before I even fully processed it. "Get in," I said softly. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine in the dark, looking for what? Pity? Reluctance? A trick? I just held his gaze, trying to project a sense of calm reassurance I was nowhere near feeling. I scooted over to the far side of my double bed, lifting the edge of the comforter in a clear, unambiguous invitation. He hesitated for another long moment, a war of emotions playing out across his face. Then, with a weary sigh that seemed to carry all the pain of the last week, he stood up and slid into the bed beside me. He lay on his back, ramrod straight, his hands clasped on his stomach, taking up as little space as possible. He was a supernova of heat and tension next to me. The space between us felt electric, a high-voltage wire of unspoken things. "It's just cold on the floor," he whispered to the ceiling, a flimsy, transparent excuse that we both tacitly agreed to accept. "I know," I whispered back. And that was it. We lay there in the dark, side by side, not touching, two bodies separated by a 6-inch canyon of friendship and fear and longing. But he was there. He was in my bed. And the ritual had changed, irrevocably. The door had been opened a little wider. From then on, he slept in my bed every night. The pretext of the floor was abandoned without comment. The new routine was established. He would come into my room. We would murmur a quiet good night. And we would get into bed, always maintaining that careful, chaste distance between us. It was an exercise in excruciating self-control. Every night, I would lie awake, hyper-aware of his presence. I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo, hear the soft rhythm of his breathing as he fell asleep, feel the warmth radiating from his body across the small gap of sheets. It was a unique and exquisite form of torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been, and yet the distance felt more immense than ever. He was seeking comfort, a human hot water bottle, a port in a storm. I was in love with him. We were in the same bed, but we were in two completely different worlds. I became a student of his sleep. I learned that he mumbled when he was dreaming, nonsensical fragments about swim times and historical figures. I learned that he was a restless sleeper, that he would often migrate across the bed in the night, his arm or his leg brushing against mine, a casual, unconscious touch that would send a jolt through my entire system and leave me wide awake for hours. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night to find that he had rolled over and thrown an arm across my chest, or curled into my back, seeking warmth. In those moments, I would lie perfectly still, my body rigid, my heart hammering against my ribs. I would breathe in his scent, feel the weight of him, and commit the feeling to memory, cataloging it like one of my photographs. It felt like a theft, stealing these moments of intimacy that he was offering unconsciously, that he would likely be horrified by if he were awake. And then, before dawn, I would gently disentangle myself, moving him back to his side of the bed, erasing the evidence of our nocturnal closeness, preserving the fragile illusion of our platonic arrangement. Slowly, very slowly, I began to see flickers of the old Leo returning. The hollowness in his eyes began to recede. He started joking with his teammates again, his laughter less forced. He was healing, and my room, our strange nightly ritual, seemed to be the core of that healing process. It was his sanctuary, the one place he could be completely unguarded. And as he started to heal, the dynamic between us began to shift again. The strict, 6-inch barrier in the bed began to erode. It started with him falling asleep while we were watching a movie, his head gradually coming to rest on my shoulder. The first time it happened, I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. But he didn't pull away. He just sighed in his sleep and snuggled closer. So I forced myself to relax, to accept the gesture for what it was on the surface, a simple act of comfort between friends. But my heart knew better. It was reading the subtext, the unspoken narrative being written in the language of touch. The cuddling became a regular occurrence. We would be on the couch, or even just sitting on my bed talking, and he would lean against me, a casual, easy gesture that was anything but casual for me. He was a tactile person by nature, something I had always known, but his breakup seemed to have amplified that need 100-fold. He needed to be anchored, and for reasons I couldn't fathom, he had chosen me as his anchor. I was terrified of what it meant, and I was terrified of it ending. I lived in a constant state of low-grade anxiety, analyzing every touch, every lingering glance, every quiet moment. Was this just what friends did? Was he so consumed by his own grief that he was blind to the implications of his actions? Or was there something more, something he himself didn't understand yet? I felt like I was trying to develop a photograph with no negative, just a faint, ghostly impression of what might be there, trying to coax an image out of the darkness. The public and private versions of our relationship grew increasingly dissonant. In the apartment, in the sanctuary of my room, we existed in a bubble of quiet, physical intimacy. But outside, he worked hard to maintain the old facade. It was with our friends, at a loud, crowded party one Friday night, that he said the words that felt like a slap. He had been trying, at the urging of his teammates, to get back out there. He was talking to a girl from his sociology class, a forced, clumsy conversation that was painful to watch. I was standing a few feet away, nursing a beer, trying to look like I was not watching his every move. His friend, Mark, clapped him on the back and pointed at me. "Don't forget your wingman," Mark said with a drunken grin. Leo laughed, a sound that was a little too loud, a little too sharp. He looked over at me, and for a second, his eyes were unreadable. Then he put on his public face, the easy, charming grin. "Of course," he said, his voice projecting across the music. "He's just my wingman. Gotta look out for me, just my wingman." The words landed like stones in my stomach. It was a public declaration, a reinforcement of the box he kept me in for the rest of the world to see. It was a reminder of my role, the supportive, platonic, non-threatening best friend. It was a brutal, casual dismissal of the quiet, intimate world we had built in the dark. I felt a hot flush of shame and anger. I gave him a tight, forced smile and a nod, then turned and made my way through the crowd, needing to get away. I ended up on the back porch, the cold night air a welcome shock to my system. I stood there for a long time, watching my breath plume in the darkness, the cheerful noise of the party a distant, mocking echo. He had drawn a line in the sand, clear and bright, and I was a fool for ever thinking we could cross it. I didn't expect him to follow me, but after about 10 minutes, the porch door creaked open. He stepped out, closing the door behind him, plunging us into a shared, quiet darkness. He didn't say anything at first. He just came and stood beside me, leaning against the railing. He was no longer smiling. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "Fine," I said, my tone clipped. "Just needed some air, I'm sorry," he said, and the words were so soft I almost didn't hear them. "About that. In there." It sounded shitty. I didn't answer. I just kept staring out into the dark backyard. I felt his gaze on me, heavy and questioning. The girl from his sociology class was forgotten. The party was forgotten. He had left it all to come and stand in the cold with me. And despite the hurt, despite the sting of his words, that fact resonated deeper than anything else. He had chosen to be here. He had followed me. After another long moment of silence, he did something that shattered my anger completely. He reached out, not his hand, but just his pinky finger, and hooked it around mine where my hand was resting on the railing. It was a tiny, tentative gesture. A question, a quiet apology, an anchor in the dark. I slowly, deliberately, uncurled my fingers and laced them with his. His hand was warm and calloused from the weights at the gym. He squeezed my hand, a brief, firm pressure, and we just stood there, holding hands in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of a party that felt a million miles away. He hadn't let anyone else near him all night. Not really. Not the girl from his class, not his boisterous teammates. He had stayed within my orbit, and when I had pulled away, he had followed. He had called me his wingman, but his actions said something else entirely. His actions said he didn't want to fly without me. That night, when we got back to the apartment, the energy between us was different. It was charged, taut, like the air before a thunderstorm. The hand-holding on the porch had been a Rubicon, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted. We went through our nightly routine in near-complete silence. I got into my side of the bed, and he got into his. But this time, when he lay down, he didn't maintain the careful distance. He turned onto his side to face me, propping his head up on his hand. The only light was the faint glow from the digital alarm clock, casting his face in soft, red numbers. "I can't do this," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. My heart plummeted. This was it. He was ending it. The ritual, the closeness, all of it. He had realized it was too weird, too much. He was going to thank me for my help and then retreat back to his own room, back to his own life, and the border would be reestablished, thicker and higher than ever before. I braced myself for the impact. "Okay," I managed to say, my own voice sounding strangled and distant. "No," he said, and he reached out, his hand hovering in the space between us for a second before it came to rest on my arm. His touch was feather-light, but it burned like a brand. "I mean, I can't do this. The pretending. I can't pretend that this is." Nothing. He gestured vaguely at the bed, at the space between us, at the whole strange, intimate world we had built within the four walls of my room. I go out there, and I try to be the person I was before, and it all feels wrong. It feels like a lie. And then I come back here, and he trailed off, shaking his head, searching for the words. And what? I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his eyes dark and intense in the gloom. He saw the fear in my face, the heartbreak I was so desperately trying to hide. His expression softened into something impossibly tender, something I had never seen on his face before. It was a look of raw, unguarded vulnerability. And it's the only thing that feels real, he breathed. He moved closer, the small distance between us vanishing completely. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking gently over my cheek. My breath hitched in my throat. This was the moment. The precipice. The culmination of years of silent longing and months of unbearable, beautiful tension. This was the moment the photograph finally resolved into a clear image. Would it be okay? He whispered, his voice thick with a question that was about so much more than what he was about to do. Would it be okay if I kissed you? I couldn't speak. I could only nod, a single, shaky movement. And it was all the permission he needed. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop him, to retreat back to the safety of our friendship. But I didn't move. I met him halfway, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was quiet. It was tentative. It was a question, an exploration, a confession. It tasted of beer and cold night air and 1,000 unspoken words. It was the softest, most soul-shattering thing I had ever experienced. It was the feeling of a locked door swinging open. It was the sound of a held breath finally being released. It was everything. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. We stayed like that for a long time, just breathing the same air, our hearts beating a frantic, synchronized rhythm. Okay, he whispered, as if in answer to his own question. And then he kissed me again, and this time there was no hesitation. There was only the quiet, stunning certainty of finding a home you never knew you were searching for. The morning after was a landscape of terrifying fragility. I woke up first, just as the sun was beginning to cast a pale, gray light into the room. Leo was still asleep, tangled in the sheets, one of his arms thrown possessively across my waist. His face, in the soft morning light, was relaxed and peaceful in a way I hadn't seen it in months. The evidence of the night before was everywhere, in the way our bodies were pressed together, in the ghost of his lips on mine, in the profound, earth-shattering shift in the very atmosphere of the room. A part of me, the part that had spent years perfecting the art of self-protection, was screaming. It was a panicked, frantic voice that insisted this was a mistake, a moment of grief-fueled confusion on his part, a fantasy that would evaporate with the morning light. It warned me that the fragile peace we had found would be shattered, that I would lose not only the hope of something more, but the friendship that had been the bedrock of my university life. I watched him sleep, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of hope and fear. I memorized the way a stray lock of his damp hair fell across his forehead, the slight flutter of his eyelids as he dreamed, the steady, reassuring rise and fall of his chest. I was trying to photograph the moment with my mind, to preserve it before it disintegrated, because I was sure it would. I was sure that he would wake up, realize what he had done, and the regret would be a chasm between us. I carefully, slowly, began to slide out from under his arm, intending to escape to the kitchen, to put some physical distance between us before he woke, to give him space to process. But the moment I moved, his arm tightened, and his eyes fluttered open. He looked at me, his gaze still clouded with sleep, and for a heart-stopping second, there was confusion in his eyes. This was it, the regret, the panic. But then, his vision cleared. He registered where he was, who he was with, and what had happened. And the expression that settled on his face was not regret. It was a slow, sleepy, and utterly genuine smile. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He pulled me back against him, burying his face in the crook of my neck. He didn't say anything else. He just held me, and after a moment, his breathing evened out again as he drifted back to sleep. And in that simple, instinctive gesture, my fear began to quiet. He hadn't pulled away. He hadn't panicked. He had woken up next to me, remembered what we had done, and his first instinct was to pull me closer. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt monumental. It felt like a foundation. But the foundation was new, and it was untested. The quiet certainty of the pre-dawn hours gave way to a daytime reality that was fraught with a new kind of awkwardness. When he finally woke up for good an hour later, the easy intimacy was gone, replaced by a nervous, crackling energy. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He got out of bed quickly, pulling on a shirt, creating a physical barrier. We made small talk about classes and practice, the words feeling clumsy and hollow in the space that had held so much silent meaning just hours before. The kiss, the confession, the entire emotional earthquake of the previous night went unmentioned. It hung between us, a shimmering, invisible wall. He left for the pool with a hurried, mumbled goodbye, and I was left alone in my room, which suddenly felt too big and too quiet. The hope of the morning had curdled into a familiar, anxious dread. I had misinterpreted everything. It had been a mistake. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. Leo became a ghost in our own apartment. He was up and out before I woke up. He came home late, after I was already in my room, ostensibly asleep. He spent his time in the library or with his teammates. The door to his own bedroom, which had been a symbol of his grief and loneliness, was now always firmly shut. He was avoiding me, and with each passing day, the silence grew heavier, more suffocating. The ritual was broken. The nights were the worst. I would lie alone in my bed, the empty space beside me a cold, aching void. The quiet of my room, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt like a punishment. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway sent a jolt of pathetic hope through me, a hope that was always extinguished when the footsteps passed my door and stopped at his. He was retreating, building his walls back up, and I was left on the outside, clutching the memory of a kiss that felt more and more like a dream. The breaking point came after nearly a week of this silent, agonizing retreat. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when he came in from Iran. He was sweaty and breathless, and he stopped short when he saw me, like a startled deer. He was trapped. There was no escape. He mumbled a greeting and moved to the fridge, keeping his back to me. The tension was unbearable, a physical presence in the room. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live in this limbo, this world of unspoken regret. I needed to know, even if the knowing would break me. "Leo," I said, my voice coming out stronger and steadier than I expected. He froze, his hand on the refrigerator door. "We need to talk." He let out a long, slow breath and finally turned to face me. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a spot on the floor just past my left foot. The confident, easygoing athlete was gone. In his place was a scared, cornered kid. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice flat. "Isn't there?" I challenged, a wave of frustration and hurt washing over me. "You kiss me, you sleep in my bed for 2 months, you tell me it's the only thing that feels real, and then you act like I don't exist. You don't think that warrants a conversation?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a miserable, conflicted agony. "I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to say the truth." I snapped, my voice rising. "Whatever it is. If it was a mistake, if you regret it, just say it. Just be honest. This silence is worse. It's cruel. I can't," he whispered, shaking his head, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I don't know what the truth is." He looked utterly lost, adrift on a sea of his own confusion. I'm not like that. I've only ever been with girls. With Jessica. This is not who I am." The words were a punch to the gut. Not who I am. He was defining himself in opposition to what had happened between us, framing it as an aberration, a temporary madness brought on by grief. He wasn't seeing it as something that involved me, another person with feelings. He was seeing it as a problem within himself, a deviation from his own self-image that he needed to correct. The hurt was so sharp, so intense, it felt like a physical blow. All the tenderness, all the intimacy, all the quiet moments that had felt so real and so profound. He was reducing them to a symptom of his own confusion. So what was it then? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. What was I? A placeholder? A convenient, warm body to get you through a tough time? Was any of it real, or were you just using me? No, he said, his head snapping up, a flash of anger in his eyes. No, it wasn't like that. It was real. God, you have to know that. It was. You were the only one I could breathe around. You were the only one who didn't look at me with pity or try to cheer me up. You just were there. He took a step closer, his hands reaching out as if to touch me, then falling back to his sides. I don't know what happened. It felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a long time. And that scares the hell out of me. There it was. The fear. It was the thing driving all of this. He wasn't scared of me. He was scared of himself, of what his feelings for me meant for his identity, for the life he had always imagined he would lead. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a new and unknown territory, and he was terrified to jump. He was trying to retreat to the familiar, to the safe and easy path, even if it was a lie. My anger began to subside, replaced by a vast, weary sadness. So you're just going to run away? I asked softly. You're going to throw away whatever this is, because you're scared? I'm trying to protect you, he said, his voice cracking. I'm a mess. I don't know what I want. I'm just going to end up hurting you. You're already hurting me, I said, the words raw and honest. By shutting me out. By pretending I'm just a phase you're going through. I'm a person, Leo. I have been in love with you for 3 years. So this isn't just some confusing moment for me. This is everything. The confession hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. His eyes widened, a look of stunned, dawning comprehension on his face. He had known, perhaps, on some subconscious level. But hearing the words, hearing the years of quiet devotion laid bare, seemed to shatter his defenses. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were seeing me for the first time. The silence stretched, and in it, I saw the war raging inside him, the fear against the undeniable truth of what he felt. Finally, he closed his eyes, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. I know, he whispered. God, I think I've known for a while. And I think I'm falling in love with you too. And I have no idea what to do with that. It was the most honest, most terrifying, and most beautiful thing he had ever said to me. He wasn't running anymore. He was standing still, in the middle of his fear and confusion, and he was finally telling the truth. The wall between us didn't crumble, it dissolved. I closed the distance between us, and this time when I put my arms around him, he didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around me, holding on tight, and buried his face in my shoulder. His body shuddered with a sob he had been holding back for a week. We stood there in the middle of our kitchen, holding each other, two people completely lost, and, for the first time, in the exact same place. The aftermath of the confession was not a magical, instantaneous fix. It was the beginning of a new kind of work, the work of talking. We sat at the kitchen table for hours, the morning turning into the afternoon, the coffee growing cold in our mugs. He talked about his fear, his confusion, the pressure he felt to be the person everyone expected him to be. He admitted that he had been so terrified by the intensity of his feelings for me that his first instinct was to try and force things back to normal, to prove to himself that the night we spent together was a fluke. He even confessed, with a deep, shuddering shame, that he had tried to call Jessica a desperate, pathetic attempt to grab onto the wreckage of his old life, but had hung up before she answered. He laid all of his fear and confusion out on the table, a messy, tangled heap of emotions. And I listened. I didn't judge. I didn't pressure him. I just gave him the space to be honest. And then I talked. I told him about the years of quiet pining, about the pain of watching him with someone else, about the terror and hope of the last few months. I told him that I didn't need him to have all the answers. I just needed him to not run away. I just needed him to be brave enough to stay and figure it out with me. We didn't solve everything in that one conversation, but we established a new foundation, One built not on ambiguity and unspoken things, but on a raw and frightening honesty. We agreed to take it slow. We agreed to be patient with each other. We agreed to talk, even when it was hard. That night, he knocked on my bedroom door. It was a soft, hesitant knock, completely different from his old, confident rap. I opened it, and he was standing there, looking nervous and hopeful all at once. "Can I?" he started, just as he had on that first night. I didn't let him finish. I just smiled, a real, genuine smile, and stepped aside, holding the door open for him. He walked in, and the room seemed to exhale, to welcome him home. We got into bed, and this time, there was no hesitation, no carefully measured distance. He immediately turned and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close, and I settled against his chest, my head tucked under his chin. It was different from all the nights before. There was no anxiety, no frantic internal monologue analyzing his every move. The tension was gone, replaced by a profound and peaceful quiet. It was an intentional intimacy, a conscious choice made by both of us. "Stay," I whispered into the fabric of his t-shirt. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured into my hair, his voice thick with sleep and certainty. And for the first time, I believed him. Before he drifted off to sleep, he reached over and, with a quiet, deliberate click, he closed my bedroom door. Not all the way, just enough to shut out the rest of the world, creating a space that was just for us. The door, which had for so long been a symbol of our ambiguity, of a path left open for his escape, was now a boundary we were drawing together. It was a promise. We began to build a new normal, one quiet moment at a time. It was in the small, domestic intimacies that our relationship truly took root. It was in the way he started keeping a toothbrush in my bathroom. It was in the mornings spent making coffee together in a comfortable, easy silence. It was in the way he would reach for my hand under the table when we were out with friends, a small, secret act of connection that was just for us. He was still Leo, the loud, energetic athlete. But there was a new softness to him, a new stillness that he reserved only for me. His teammates were confused at first, then slowly, surprisingly, accepting. They saw that he was happy, truly happy, in a way they hadn't seen him before. The world didn't end. His identity didn't shatter. He just expanded to include me, to include us. I continued to take his picture, but the images changed. They were no longer just about the powerful athlete in the water. They were quieter, more intimate. A shot of him laughing, his head thrown back, the morning light catching in his hair. A photo of his hand, resting on a textbook, his fingers relaxed. A close-up of his face while he slept, the complete and total trust he placed in me evident even in his unconsciousness. I was no longer just an observer in his life. I was a part of the composition. My darkroom, once my solitary sanctuary, became a place we shared. He would sit in the dim, red light, watching me work, his presence a warm, comforting weight in the quiet. He said he finally understood why I loved it so much. It was a place where you could take all the messy, chaotic light of the world and transform it into something clear, something beautiful, something permanent. There are moments in your life that are not beginnings, but arrivals. They are the moments when you look at the person next to you and realize that the long, winding, and often painful road you have been on has led you exactly where you were always meant to be. It is not a loud revelation, but a quiet, cellular knowing. It's the peace that settles in your bones, the end of a search you didn't even realize you were on. For me, that arrival happens every night. It happens when Leo turns to me in the quiet dark of our room, the room that is now truly ours, and pulls me close. It happens when I feel the steady, familiar rhythm of his heartbeat against my back, a quiet, constant language that says, "You are safe, you are home." We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. We were no longer defined by the borders between us, but by the quiet, comfortable, and infinite space we had finally built for ourselves.